Water holds the power to create and to erase, but its absence can be even more revealing. A drought is not just a lack of rain. It is a slow, relentless pullback of a curtain, exposing secrets that water has kept for decades, centuries, even millennia. This is a journey into the bizarre history written by dry spells. We are about to explore 33 of the weirdest drought stories ever to unfold across the United States. You will hear tales of sunken towns rising from lakebeds, of prehistoric giants emerging from muddy graves, and of communities driven to schemes so desperate they border on madness. These stories reveal a side of America rarely seen, where human ingenuity and raw survival instincts clash with an unyielding sky. By the end, you will see the very map of the nation change, not through conquest but through evaporation. How does a vanishing river lead to a mobster's confession, or a cracked lakebed to an ancient child's footprint? What strange artifact might be waiting in the dust of your own backyard? The first story begins with a coil of black basalt rock, 1,500 feet long, laid into the pinkish water of Utah's Great Salt Lake. This is the Spiral Jetty, an earthwork sculpture created by the artist Robert Smithson in 1970. Smithson chose this remote location specifically for the water, for the way the lake's changing mineral content and algae would color the rocks, and for the inevitable, slow process of entropy. He built it to be submerged, to be changed by time and tide, but in the grip of a severe drought, something profound and unsettling happens. The water retreats, sometimes for miles. The spiral jetty does not merely become visible, it becomes a dry, cracked path you can walk from end to end. The black rocks become encrusted with brilliant white salt crystals, a ghostly, glittering ridge against the vast, exposed lake bed. What was once a mysterious aquatic form becomes a stark, terrestrial monument. Pilgrims of art who once had to wade through shallow water now find a desert trail. There is a deep, haunting irony here. Smithson's work contemplated decay and the relentless force of time, yet it is not being worn away by water but fully exposed by its absence. A sculpture about entropy is being unveiled in all its stark, beautiful strangeness by the very climate extremes that now define our era. It is a perfect, silent symbol of how drought does not just reveal the past but recontextualizes the present, turning a meditation on natural cycles into an urgent bulletin from a drying world. The Platte River in Nebraska is a wide, shallow braid of water, a historic highway for sandhill cranes and pioneers alike. But when drought grips the Great Plains, this river does not just shrink. It transforms into something else entirely, a place the locals call the Bone Valley. As the water retreats, the sandy riverbed cracks open to reveal a staggering secret. Beneath the gravel and silt are not just a few scattered fossils, but vast, concentrated beds of bones. We are talking about hundreds, sometimes thousands, of specimens piled together. This is the graveyard of the Ice Age. Here lie the colossal remains of woolly mammoths and American mastodons, their giant tusks and molars emerging from the dust. Mixed among them are the skulls and skeletons of ancient bison, far larger than their modern descendants, and the bones of camels and giant ground sloths that once roamed a Nebraska that looked more like the African savanna. These animals did not die here one by one. Paleontologists believe they were trapped, likely during ancient droughts just as severe as the ones we see today. Picture a shrinking waterhole 10,000 years ago. Desperate herds of mammoths would gather at the last remaining mudhole, a treacherous quagmire. The weaker ones would become stuck, their immense weight sealing their fate, attracting predators and creating a macabre accumulation of death. Then, over millennia, the river would bury the scene in sediment, preserving it like a time capsule. Modern drought performs the excavation. It peels back the watery cover, turning the Platte River into an accidental archaeological dig site. For scientists, it is a rare and urgent opportunity. They race against the next rain, carefully extracting history from the drying mud, piece by prehistoric piece. One moment you're walking a dry river channel, and the next your boot is resting against the curve of a tusk that last felt the air when humans hunted with spears. It is a humbling reminder that the ground beneath us is not just dirt. It is an archive, and sometimes a drought is the librarian pulling a very old, very heavy book off the shelf. The Platte River is not the only waterway giving up its dead. Far to the southwest, a different kind of drought revelation was unfolding, one that traded prehistoric tusks for concrete barrels and ice age mysteries for cold cases. Lake Mead, the colossal reservoir behind the Hoover Dam, was shrinking at an alarming rate. As the waterline fell foot by foot, it exposed a stark, chalky ring around the shoreline known as the Bathtub Ring, a monument to the drought's severity. But in the spring of 2022, boaters near Hemingway Harbor found something far more sinister than a receding beach. A rusted barrel wedged in the mud had surfaced. Inside were human remains. The initial assumption was a tragic drowning victim, but the barrel changed everything. This was not an accident, this was a disposal. Almost immediately, a dark and tantalizing theory took hold in the public imagination. Las Vegas, just a short drive away, had been built on a foundation of glamour shadowed by organized crime. For decades, the desert had been rumored to be the final resting place for those who crossed the wrong people. The dropping waters of Lake Mead seemed to be confirming the oldest Vegas folklore. The lake was giving up its secrets, one gruesome barrel at a time. The detective work became a grim race against evaporation and time. As the lake level continued to plummet, more barrels were found. Some contained multiple sets of remains. One victim was identified as a man who had vanished in the late 1970s, a time when mob influence in the city was at its peak. The evidence suggested executions, bodies stuffed into containers and dumped into the deep where they were meant to stay forever, preserved in the cold, dark water. But the drought had other plans. It turned the nation's largest reservoir into a crime scene investigator, slowly draining the world's biggest potential hiding place. Each new foot of exposed lakebed became an area to be scanned, a new clue waiting in the cracked mud. The story was no longer just about water shortage. It was about a reckoning. The very element meant to conceal these acts, the deep, abundant water symbolizing mid-century American ambition, was retreating, forcing a confrontation with a violent, buried chapter of history. What was intended to be a permanent, liquid grave was now a drying desert, offering a form of closure no one could have predicted, delivered not by a detective's badge but by a devastating lack of rain. While drought in the desert could reveal mob hits, in the farmlands it promised something more ancient and bewildering. During the brutal Dust Bowl years of the 1930s, the very soil of Oklahoma seemed to be turning to dust and blowing away. Creeks and watering holes evaporated, scoured by relentless wind. Near the town of Custer, a farmer checking his parched land noticed something colossal protruding from a dried-up creek bed. It was a bone, but unlike any he had ever seen. It was massive, curved, and strangely alien. Word spread quickly through the desperate, dust-choked community. They gathered around the giant fragment, their imaginations ignited by hardship and mystery. With no frame of reference in their landlocked world, they arrived at a single, spectacular conclusion. They had dug up the skeleton of a sea serpent, a monster from some primordial ocean buried in the heart of the prairie. The idea was not as far-fetched as it might seem. For people living through an environmental catastrophe, the ground itself felt unstable, capable of anything. The discovery offered a strange kind of escape, a legend rising literally from the dust. Of course, scientists eventually arrived to solve the mystery. The bone was not from a serpent, but something almost as improbable. It was the vertebrae of a zeuglodon, a prehistoric whale that swam the ancient seas over 30 million years ago. This was the real shock. Oklahoma, a state known for wheat fields and oil rigs, was once the bottom of a vast, warm ocean. The drought had not just exposed a bone. It had exposed an entire lost geography. That farmer's creek bed was a fossilized seafloor. The dust blowing over his failed crops was the pulverized remains of marine creatures. The find forced a profound mental shift. The Dust Bowl was a crisis of the present, but the bone was a crisis of deep time, proof that even the most permanent-seeming landscapes are temporary. Your home, your town, the very ground beneath your feet, might be resting on a world that is utterly unrecognizable. All it takes is a long, dry spell to offer a glimpse of the unthinkable change that is always possible. The bone in Oklahoma was a mystery solved by science, but in modern California, drought created a different kind of puzzle, one played out not in creek beds but on cul-de-sacs and social media feeds. When the state faced its most severe dry spells, the battle to conserve water moved from government mandates to front lawns, morphing into a fierce social experiment. This was the era of drought shaming. The rules were clear, enforced by emergency ordinances. Watering your lawn on the wrong day or letting your sprinklers hit the pavement was not just wasteful, it was a civic sin. And your neighbors were watching. People took to apps like Nextdoor and Twitter, posting photos and videos of the offenders, lush green grass shining like a beacon of defiance in a brown landscape, sprinklers arcing over deserted sidewalks at high noon. They did not just post the evidence, they named names, often including addresses. The comment sections became digital town squares buzzing with outrage. "Look at this water hog," they would write. "My kids are taking 2-minute showers and this guy has a private oasis." It was vigilante conservation, driven by a potent mix of genuine environmental concern and sheer frustration. The pressure became so intense that cities formalized the watchfulness. They established water waste hotlines, encouraging residents to anonymously report their neighbors. Code enforcement officers, dubbed the water police by the media, would patrol neighborhoods, issuing warnings and then fines that could climb into the hundreds of dollars for repeat violations. A green lawn was no longer a point of pride, it was a potential scarlet letter. This created a strange moral battleground. On one side were those who saw it as a necessary collective effort, a way to police a scarce resource for the greater good during a crisis. On the other were those who felt it was an invasion of privacy, a hysterical overreach that turned communities against each other over a few extra gallons on a rose bush. The tension exposed a fundamental question about how societies behave under scarcity. Do we pull together, accepting mutual surveillance as the price of survival, or do we fracture into suspicion and resentment? The lush lawn became more than just a landscaping choice. It was a political statement, a declaration of independence or indifference, viewed through the parched lens of a community trying to hold itself together while the taps threatened to run dry. While neighbors policed each other's sprinklers in California, a much older community was staging a silent, eerie comeback hundreds of miles away. Beneath the shimmering surface of Lake Mead, an entire town was waiting for its moment in the sun again. This is the story of St. Thomas, Nevada. Founded by Mormon pioneers in 1865 along the fertile banks of the Muddy River, St. Thomas was a thriving little outpost. It had a post office, a hotel, schools, and farms that prospered from the reliable water. For nearly 7 decades, life unfolded there with a rhythm defined by harvests and community. Then, in the 1930s, the federal government made a decision that would erase it from the map. The Hoover Dam was complete, and the mighty Colorado River began to back up, slowly filling the vast basin that would become Lake Mead. The residents of St. Thomas were told to leave. They watched as the water crept toward their homes, their church, their cemetery. Finally, in 1938, the last holdout, a man named Hugh Lord, rode away from his own house as water flowed through the front door. St. Thomas vanished beneath the waves, becoming a submerged memory, a sacrifice for the progress that would power and water the modern Southwest. For generations, it was just a story, a piece of local lore. But drought changes the terms of every bargain. As Lake Mead's water level plummeted during the 21st century's severe dry spells, the ghost town began to return. First, the highest foundations of the old Gentry Hotel broke the surface like stone fingers grasping for air. Then, as more water retreated, an entire spectral landscape materialized from the cracked gray lakebed. The concrete outlines of long-gone homes and the schoolhouse became visible. The old highway, Route 91, reappeared, its crumbling pavement leading straight into the vanished heart of town. Visitors could walk these dusty streets, peering into cellar holes where families once stored their food. They could find old glass bottles, rusted tools, and the solemn, sun-bleached gravestones from the relocated cemetery, some still standing sentinel. Walking through St. Thomas is an experience that chills the soul. You are not just looking at ruins, you are walking on the bottom of a lake that drowned a community. The silence is profound, broken only by the wind whistling through the foundations. You can stand where Hugh Lord's porch once was, looking out at a horizon that is now a distant shoreline, and feel the immense weight of that trade-off, the cost of the water that once covered your feet. The town's reemergence is more than a curiosity. It is a tangible, unsettling monument to the cycles of water and human ambition. It asks a haunting question: what happens when the reservoir created to ensure a region's future can no longer hold back the past? The ghost town of St. Thomas rose from the lakebed as a monument to human displacement, but in the face of a relentless drought, some communities decided to fight back not by moving, but by declaring war on the sky itself. This brings us to one of the most desperate and explosive chapters in American weather history, the era of the dynamite rainmakers. In the early 20th century, as droughts scorched Texas and the Great Plains, farmers watched their livelihoods turn to dust. Their desperation became a fertile market for charlatans and would be scientists peddling a miraculous solution: artificial rain. These rainmakers, often traveling salesmen with a flair for drama, proposed a theory that sounded just plausible enough to bankrupt a town. They argued that the concussive force of a massive explosion could shock the atmosphere, jostling clouds into releasing their precious cargo. It was not subtle. Their weapon of choice was dynamite. The schemes were theatrical and wildly dangerous. One common method involved packing balloons with a volatile mix of oxygen and hydrogen, then sending them soaring thousands of feet into the air before detonating them with an electrical charge. The hope was to seed the clouds from within. Other plans were more straightforward and more terrestrial. They would pile hundreds of pounds of dynamite onto a platform or into a deep pit, wire it all together, and on a designated day, with the entire town gathered at a safe distance, they would light the fuse. The resulting blast would be cataclysmic, shaking windows for miles, the sound echoing across the barren plains like the wrath of an angry god. Communities would pool their dwindling resources to pay these rainmakers, sometimes thousands of dollars, a staggering sum for the time. They were not just buying explosives, they were buying hope. The spectacle itself became a ritual, a collective act of defiance against the endless blue sky. People would stare upward after the thunder of man-made dynamite faded, searching for any wisp of cloud, any hint of a change, and sometimes by sheer coincidence it would rain. A passing weather front would bring a shower a day or two later, and the rainmaker would claim victory, collecting his fee and moving on to the next parched town. But the truth was written in the dust. The explosions did nothing. The campaigns were utterly futile, a dangerous and expensive placebo for a suffering population. They reveal a profound human impulse when faced with an incomprehensible natural force. We would rather create a spectacular, controllable catastrophe on the ground than endure the silent, invisible one happening above us. It was the ultimate expression of frustration, trying to bully the heavens into submission with the very tools used to reshape the earth. The dynamite rainmakers sought to conquer the sky with force, but in the heartland, a different kind of appeal was being organized, one that traded explosives for hymns. During the brutal droughts of the 1950s, as crops withered under a copper sun, entire towns across the Midwest turned not to science or spectacle, but to collective faith. They organized pray for rain festivals. These were not quiet, private devotions. They were public, town-wide events sanctioned by churches and city councils alike, blending solemnity with a desperate civic spirit. The planning had the earnest detail of a county fair. A date was set, notices went up in post offices and diners, schools closed early. On the appointed day, the community would gather, often in the central square or the football field. There would be a parade, not with floats celebrating harvest, but with tractors and children carrying handmade signs pleading for mercy from the clouds. Then, at a designated hour, everything would stop. Farmers in their work clothes, shopkeepers, housewives, and children would bow their heads together. A local minister or priest would lead a prayer, his voice amplified over a crackling loudspeaker, asking not for wealth or comfort, but for the most basic element of life itself. In some towns, they tried to amplify their plea through sheer concentration. Reports from Kansas and Nebraska describe attempts at mass meditation, where hundreds of people were urged to sit in silence and collectively visualize dark, rain-heavy clouds forming overhead. They believed that the unified focus of a community's hope could somehow pierce the atmospheric stillness. It was a profound and poignant act. On one level, it was a direct, sincere expression of faith, a turning to divine intervention when all human effort had failed. On another, it was a powerful social ritual, a way to combat the helplessness and isolation that drought breeds. When your fields are dying and your neighbors are suffering the same fate, coming together to ask for help, even if that help is from above, creates a fragile sense of solidarity. It said, "We are in this together and we are not giving up." These festivals highlight a crucial distinction from the dynamite campaigns. The rainmakers sold a fake technology, a violent shortcut. The prayer festivals were an admission of powerlessness, a communal surrender to forces beyond human control, yet done with a stubborn, collective hope. They framed the drought not as a mechanical problem to be solved, but as a spiritual trial to be endured together. The festivals rarely, if ever, produced a downpour. But for an afternoon, they may have produced something else just as vital, a brief respite from despair and a reminder that even under a rainless sky, a community was still a living thing. The collective prayers of the Midwest were an appeal to the heavens, but in the sun-baked deserts of Arizona, a different kind of seeker looked downward, placing their faith in a branch and their own two hands. When severe drought grips the state, threatening wells and straining the vast aquifers beneath the surface, an ancient practice experiences a quiet but undeniable resurgence. This is water dowsing, often called water witching. Practitioners, known as dowsers, walk slowly across a property holding a forked stick, usually from a willow or peach tree or a pair of L-shaped metal rods. They claim the stick will suddenly dip toward the earth or the rods will cross, signaling the presence of hidden water below. In an era of satellite surveys and advanced hydrogeology, it seems like a relic from a superstitious past. Yet during water crises, the phone of a local dowser can ring constantly. Modern dowsers are often earnest, practical people. They might be well drillers who use the method alongside their technical equipment, or retirees who believe they have a natural gift. In interviews, they speak of a palpable pull, a vibration they feel in their hands that guides them. It is not just about finding water, they say, but about finding the best spot, the sweet seam that will yield a strong, lasting well. They frame it as an intuitive art, a partnership with the land that technology cannot replicate. Geologists and physicists, however, are unified in their skepticism. The scientific consensus is clear. There is no known mechanism by which a person holding a stick could detect underground water. Controlled, double-blind studies have repeatedly shown that dowsers perform no better than random chance. Experts explain that the movement of the rods or stick is caused by the ideomotor effect, an unconscious muscle movement driven by the dowser's own expectations. They are, in essence, moving the tools themselves without realizing it. So why does this practice persist and even flourish during a drought? The answer lies in the psychology of crisis and the nature of the desert itself. Drilling a well is a monumental expense, often costing tens of thousands of dollars. It is a high-stakes gamble in a landscape where water is buried deep and unpredictably. For a landowner facing that terrifying financial risk, the dowser offers something priceless: certainty. The ritual provides a tangible decision point, a moment where a human, not a machine, declares, "Dig here." It transforms an abstract, anxiety-inducing process into a concrete action. The dowser becomes a modern-day shaman, bridging the gap between human need and an invisible, life-giving resource. In a way, the forked stick is less a scientific instrument and more a psychological tool, a focus for hope in a parched and uncertain land. It is a testament to the enduring power of ritual when the taps of modern life begin to run dry. The dowsers of Arizona searched for hidden water, but a far greater river would soon reveal a secret it had kept for over a century. In 2012, a historic drought squeezed the mighty Mississippi River down to a shadow of itself. Near Memphis, the water dropped so low that a strange, forgotten landmass broke the surface, an island that was not on any modern map. Locals knew it by an ominous name: the Forbidden Island. Its official name, President's Island, did little to soften its chilling past. As the river retreated, it exposed not just mud and sand, but the grim foundations of a 19th century nightmare. This island had once been a quarantine station, a place of utter desperation during the yellow fever epidemics that repeatedly ravaged Memphis. When the fever, carried by mosquitoes, would sweep through the city, the healthy would flee in panic. But those already sick and those suspected of carrying the disease were forcibly removed. They were loaded onto barges and towed across the river to this isolated slip of land, abandoned there with only makeshift tents and scant supplies. It was less a hospital and more a dumping ground, a place to contain the dying away from the living. For decades, the river rose and covered this sorrowful chapter, burying it under silt and current. But the drought of 2012 pulled back the water like a curtain. Suddenly, you could walk where the quarantine tents once stood. The low water exposed the rotten pilings of old piers, rusted medical equipment half fused into the clay, and the stark, pale fragments of human bone. These were the remains of victims who never made it off the island, buried in shallow graves that the river had slowly eroded over time. The sight was a visceral shock. Here was the physical evidence of a community's trauma, a stark reminder of a time when a city sacrificed its sick to save itself. The artifacts were not ancient relics, they were from an era of photographs and newspapers, making the discovery feel unnervingly recent. For a few eerie months, the Forbidden Island lived up to its name again, a place of quiet dread temporarily resurrected by a lack of rain, forcing Memphis to confront a ghost it had hoped the river had swallowed forever. The exposed bones of the Forbidden Island told a story of human desperation in the face of disease, but an earlier generation of Americans was sold a different kind of fantasy, one that promised to conquer the climate itself. In the late 1800s, as railroads stretched their iron fingers across the Great Plains, they faced a monumental marketing problem. The land they now owned, thanks to massive government grants, was the vast, dry expanse west of the 100th meridian, a region pioneers had long called the Great American Desert. Who would buy this land? Who would settle it if they believed nothing could grow there? The solution was not to improve the land, but to rewrite reality. Railroads, land speculators, and even some scientists began promoting a seductive and utterly false idea known as rain follows the plow. The theory was elegantly simple and perfectly suited to the American myth of progress. It claimed that human settlement itself would change the weather. The act of breaking the sod, planting crops, and building towns would release moisture into the air. The very vibrations of civilization, from plows cutting the earth to trains rumbling across the prairie, would somehow encourage clouds to form. It was a promise that sweat and industry could literally make it rain. This was not just hopeful talk, it was a concerted propaganda campaign. Glossy pamphlets paid for by railroad companies flooded the East. They featured lush illustrations of Kansas and Nebraska as veritable gardens with fat livestock and towering corn. Lectures were given by charismatic boosters who cited dubious scientific data. The message was clear: come west, work the land, and you will create your own paradise. The Homestead Act offered the land for free, and now this theory offered the rain for free too. It was an irresistible package. Thousands of families, many fresh from Europe or struggling in eastern cities, took the bait. They loaded their wagons with the phrase "rain follows the plow" ringing in their ears, a mantra of manifest destiny. For a few wetter-than-average years in the 1880s, it seemed the boosters might be right. Settlers broke the ancient, deep-rooted prairie sod and planted wheat. The rains came and the wheat grew tall. Towns sprang up. The desert was indeed blooming, and the railroads sold every acre they could. But the prairie grass those settlers plowed under had held that land in place for millennia. Its roots were a dense, living net that trapped moisture and soil. The wheat they planted had shallow roots. Then the climate cycle inevitably turned. The rains stopped, the dry winds began to blow. Without the prairie grass anchor, the topsoil, now pulverized into dust, simply lifted into the air. Those carefully plowed fields did not create rain, they created the first chapters of the Dust Bowl. The farms failed, the dreams evaporated, and the great clouds that followed the plow were not made of water, but of the very earth people had hoped to tame. It was one of the most catastrophic collisions between human ambition and atmospheric truth in American history. A disaster sold with a brochure and bought with blind faith. The promise that rain would follow the plow was a catastrophic fantasy, but the dream of controlling the weather never truly died. It simply evolved, trading folk magic for chemistry and dynamite for aircraft. In the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains, a quiet, high-stakes conflict has been unfolding for decades. One fought not over water rights on the ground, but over the very clouds in the sky. This is the era of cloud seeding, a modern attempt at weather modification that feels equal parts science fiction and desperate pragmatism. States like Colorado and Wyoming, whose rivers are born from winter snowpack, now send specialized planes into the heart of storm systems. Their mission is not to observe, but to intervene. Pilots fly along mountain ridges, releasing plumes of a fine, smoke-like substance into promising clouds. That substance is silver iodide, a compound whose crystalline structure closely resembles that of natural ice. The theory is elegant. By introducing these artificial ice nuclei into a cloud supercooled with moisture, you provide a template for snowflakes to form. More nuclei mean more snowflakes, which in theory means more snow falling onto the watersheds below. It is an attempt to wring every last drop of moisture from the sky, a technological squeeze play on the clouds themselves. For the water managers in these states, it is a calculated investment, a way to boost crucial snowpack by a potential 5 to 15%. They see it as a tool akin to building a small atmospheric reservoir. But this practice does not exist in a vacuum. Clouds drift, and weather systems are not respecters of state lines. This is where the controversy ignites, sparking what some call the cloud seeding wars. Downwind communities, often in neighboring states, look at those plains with deep suspicion. They voice a fear that is both primal and difficult to prove. Are you stealing our rain? The concern is that by seeding a cloud over Colorado, you might cause it to dump its payload prematurely, leaving it empty by the time it drifts over, say, Kansas or Nebraska. It frames the atmosphere as a zero-sum game, where one region's gain is another's loss. This fear has escalated beyond grumbling into legal and diplomatic skirmishes. Interstate lawsuits and tense negotiations have become part of the process, with states demanding proof that cloud seeding does not harm their share of the hydrological pie. The science, however, offers no easy verdict. Proving that a specific snowfall would not have happened without human intervention is notoriously difficult, as is tracing a precise atmospheric theft. The controversy exposes a fundamental tension in our relationship with nature. As our ability to manipulate complex systems grows, so too does the ambiguity of the consequences. We are no longer just praying for rain or blowing up the sky. We are engaged in subtle, global-scale chemistry experiments where the fallout is measured in snowpack reports and interstate legal briefs. It raises a profound question for an increasingly thirsty world. If we learn how to tip the scales of weather in our favor, who decides which way they lean? The cloud seeding wars represent a high-tech struggle over atmospheric moisture, but sometimes a drought uncovers a record far more personal than any legal dispute. When water retreats from riverbeds and lake shores, it can reveal the literal footsteps of our ancient ancestors, pressed into mud that hardened into stone millennia ago. These are not artifacts or bones, but moments captured in startling detail. In New Mexico, the brutal drought that has gripped the Southwest has performed a miraculous act of historical preservation, peeling back the water to expose entire trackways of ancient human footprints. At White Sands National Park, a vast dry lakebed known as Alkali Flat became a time capsule. As the crusty surface cracked, researchers found not just a few prints, but hundreds of them etched into the once saturated ground. Using meticulous dating techniques, they made a staggering announcement. Some of these footprints were over 20,000 years old. That date is revolutionary, pushing back the timeline of human presence in the Americas by thousands of years. But the true magic lies in the stories these tracks tell. One set shows the footprints of a child, perhaps no more than 6 years old, walking in a straight line for nearly a mile. The steps are small and close together, a lonely journey across a vast, muddy plain. In another area, the prints reveal a group of children, their tracks mingling and weaving, showing signs of slipping and sliding in the mud. This was not a grim migration, it was play. You can almost hear the echoes of laughter across 20,000 years. Then there are the hunting scenes. Alongside the human prints are the colossal, dinner plate-sized tracks of a giant ground sloth. The human footprints approach carefully, then circle the animal, showing a coordinated stalk. In one chilling sequence, the sloth tracks rise onto its hind legs, likely in a defensive posture, as the humans close in. It is a snapshot of survival, a tactical maneuver frozen in dried mud. Similar discoveries emerged along the parched banks of the Rio Grande. There, footprints show a person moving at a brisk walking pace, perhaps carrying something heavy, their steps deeper on one side. Another trail captures a mother setting her child down briefly in the mud before picking them up and continuing on. These are not grand monuments or tools, they are the mundane, intimate moments of daily life, preserved with a clarity that bones and stones can never offer. A drought did this. It removed the shallow veil of modern water, allowing us to walk, quite literally, in the footsteps of the first Americans. To see a child's playful meander from the last ice age is to collapse time, to feel a connection that transcends all the centuries in between. It turns a dry lakebed into the most poignant history book imaginable, one written not in words but in the quiet pressure of a foot against the earth. While ancient footprints tell of a world shaped by water, modern Las Vegas is engineering a future defined by its absence. The city's very existence is a paradox, a glittering oasis built in the driest desert in North America, entirely dependent on a single, shrinking source, the Colorado River. As the river's flow diminished year after year, Vegas faced a reckoning. It could not simply pray for rain or seed clouds. Its survival demanded a radical, tangible change to the city's own skin. The answer was not found in a new reservoir, but in the front yards of its residents. Las Vegas declared war on the lawn. The centerpiece of this battle is the Southern Nevada Water Authority's cash for grass rebate program. It is a straightforward, powerful deal. The city pays you to rip out your thirsty green turf and replace it with desert-friendly landscaping, a practice known as xeriscaping. The math is brutally clear. 1 square foot of grass in the Vegas heat consumes about 73 gallons of water per year. A typical lawn, thousands upon thousands of gallons. The rebate program offered, and still offers, a financial incentive for every square foot of grass removed, turning conservation into a direct transaction. The effect has been transformative and visible from space. Over the past 2 decades, the program has overseen the removal of more than 200 million square feet of turf. That is an area larger than 5,000 football fields, all once guzzling Colorado River water, now converted to gravel, drought-tolerant plants, and decorative rock. Neighborhoods have undergone a stark aesthetic shift. The lush, emerald green carpets that symbolized suburban success in the 20th century are vanishing. In their place, a new desert palette has emerged, one of silvery sagebrush, spiky agave, bursts of colorful desert marigolds, and artistic arrangements of sandstone and crushed granite. This is not just about saving water, it is about redefining beauty and status in a desert city. A meticulously xeriscaped yard with its careful composition and architectural plants has become a badge of civic responsibility and modern taste. The program has created its own economy, with landscaping companies specializing in turf removal and desert design, and garden centers pivoting to stock native plants. Of course, this shift sparked a cultural conflict as well. For some longtime residents, especially those who moved from greener states, the lawn was a piece of home, a symbol of normalcy and comfort. Watching their street transform from a familiar green suburb into a rocky, southwestern landscape felt like a loss, an admission of defeat to the desert they had tried to keep at bay. The city was in effect imposing a drought tax, not with a bill but with a mandate to change the very ground around your home, yet the results are undeniable. While the city's population has soared, its total water consumption has actually dropped by about a quarter since 2002. The grass removal program is a huge part of that success. It represents a profound philosophical pivot from defying the desert to embracing it. Las Vegas is learning to wear its environment not as a costume, but as its true face, proving that in a crisis, the most powerful technology might not be a new pipe or a deeper well, but a simple shovel and a willingness to reimagine what home is supposed to look like. Las Vegas learned to survive by shedding its skin, but in Southern California, a dying lake is exposing a poison that cannot be so easily removed. The Salton Sea was never meant to be permanent. Created by a colossal engineering accident in 1905 when the Colorado River burst its banks, this vast inland sea became an accidental oasis. For decades, it was a desert riviera, a playground for boaters and a critical stopover for millions of migratory birds. Its water came from agricultural runoff, a steady diet of tainted nourishment that held the secret to its future demise. Now, a punishing drought and water transfers to coastal cities are starving the sea. It is shrinking at a terrifying rate, retreating hundreds of feet each year. What it leaves behind is not a benign beach, but a nightmare of chemistry known as the playa. This exposed lakebed is a crusted wasteland of salt, laced with a century's accumulation of pesticides like DDT, heavy metals like selenium and arsenic from the surrounding fields, and fertilizers. When the desert winds whip up, which they do with ferocious regularity, this toxic powder does not stay put. It becomes airborne, a thick, poisonous dust that scientists call particulate matter 2.5, fine enough to penetrate deep into human lungs and the bloodstream. For the communities surrounding the sea, predominantly low income and Latino, this is not an abstract environmental issue, it is a daily health emergency. The rate of childhood asthma hospitalization in the region is among the highest in California. Emergency room visits for respiratory distress spike on windy days. Parents describe keeping their children indoors during dust storms, watching a brown haze settle over everything, knowing that each breath carries a cocktail of industrial and agricultural waste. The crisis is compounded by a grotesque biological collapse. As the sea shrinks and becomes saltier, fish die-offs occur by the millions. The rotting carcasses of tilapia and corvina wash up in putrid lines, creating a stench that carries for miles and adding a biological toxin to the blowing dust. The very birds that once thrived here now die of botulism and other diseases, their bodies littering the receding shore. The Salton Sea presents a uniquely modern horror, a slow-motion disaster where the symptom, the lack of water, is unveiling the disease, the toxic legacy of our own land use. It is a stark lesson in unintended consequences, where the solutions for one community's water security become the source of another's existential threat. The retreating water isn't just revealing a shoreline, it is revealing a profound and dangerous debt, one that is now coming due, particle by poisonous particle on the wind. The toxic dust of the Salton Sea is a modern legacy of human engineering, but the American Southwest holds older, deeper scars written not in chemicals, but in tree rings and silent stone. Centuries before the first European set foot on the continent, a thriving civilization faced a slow, inescapable squeeze. The ancestral Pueblones, master builders of the cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde and the great houses of Choco Canyon, did not simply vanish. They made a choice to leave everything behind, and the reason may be etched in the very skeletons of ancient trees. A theory, built from decades of archaeological and climatological detective work, points to a villain both mundane and catastrophic, a drought that did not just last a few bad seasons but gripped the land for over 2 decades. From around 1276 to 1299 AD, the region was strangled by a profound dry spell known as the Great Drought. Tree rings from that period tell a stark story. Each year's growth is a narrow, desperate line, a record of thirst written in wood. For a culture whose survival was meticulously calibrated to the arrival of summer rains for their corn, beans, and squash, this was not a hardship, it was an existential sentence. The evidence of collapse is written in the bones of the people themselves. Skeletal remains from the late 13th century show clear signs of chronic malnutrition and acute starvation. There is a condition called porotic hyperostosis, a spongy, porous appearance on the skull that results from severe anemia, often linked to iron deficiency from a diet lacking in meat and fresh vegetables. The bones of children from this era are stunted, their growth halted by relentless hunger. But drought does not only bring famine, it brings fear, and fear brings conflict. The archaeological record reveals a dark turn. Villages that were once open began to fortify. Settlements moved to more defensible positions, high on mesa tops or deep within canyon alcoves, not just for shelter but for protection. At some sites, archaeologists have found unburied bodies showing signs of violent trauma, left where they fell in a final, chaotic struggle. Storage rooms that once held communal grain were burned, suggesting raiding and warfare over the last precious reserves. The social contract, the intricate web of cooperation that built the great kivas and sustained complex societies, was fraying under the unrelenting sun. The theory suggests this great drought was the final, unbearable pressure. It was not a single event that killed a president or a king, but a prolonged environmental tyranny that killed a way of life. One by one, the springs and seeps they relied upon went dry. The corn withered in the fields before it could tassel. The careful balance between population and resources maintained for generations shattered. And so they walked away. They left their magnificent stone cities nestled in cliffs, their pottery, their tools, the graves of their ancestors, and migrated south and east, eventually merging with other Pueblo groups. Their departure was so complete, so deliberate, that when later peoples encountered these empty cities, they seemed the work of ghosts. The story of the ancestral Pueblones is a haunting reminder that drought is more than a weather pattern, it is a social force. It can unravel the most sophisticated societies, turning neighbors into rivals and sacred homes into traps. It asks us a quiet, unsettling question as we look at our own vast cities and complex networks. What prolonged dry spell might it take for us to make the choice to simply walk away from it all? The silent ruins of Choco Canyon stand as a monument to a civilization undone by thirst, but human attempts to outsmart drought have often backfired in spectacular and far more mobile ways. In the 1870s, as settlers pushed into the arid plains, they faced the same old enemy, a lack of reliable feed for their cattle when the rains failed. Desperation bred a dangerous optimism, and a potential solution arrived in a small, unassuming package. A group of Russian immigrants, possibly Mennonites from the steppes, brought with them seeds of a plant known as Russian thistle. It was a hardy, drought-resistant shrub from a similarly harsh climate, and it promised to be the perfect forage crop for the dry American West. Farmers eagerly planted it, hopeful they had finally found a way to cheat the dry seasons. The plant, however, had plans of its own. Russian thistle is what we now know as the classic tumbleweed. That first summer, it grew just as advertised, providing some greenery. But then it revealed its true, monstrous nature. At the end of its life cycle, the entire plant dries into a brittle, spherical skeleton, severing itself from its root with a sharp crack. Then the wind takes over. These light, tangled balls become rolling vagrants of the desert, driven by the slightest breeze across hundreds of miles. A single plant can produce up to 250,000 seeds, and as it tumbles, it scatters them like a demented farmer sowing a cursed harvest. Within a few decades, the experiment in drought-proofing had unleashed an ecological plague. The tumbleweed did not stay on the ranches, it conquered the West, choking out native grasses and colonizing disturbed soil with terrifying efficiency. In times of severe drought, the problem transforms from a nuisance into a surreal and tangible threat. With no moisture to weigh them down or soften the landscape, the brittle balls multiply and travel farther. They pile up against fences, creating massive prickly drifts that can bend steel and bury boundary lines. They stack against the sides of homes and barns, reaching the eaves, trapping residents inside. The sheer weight can collapse weaker structures, but the most terrifying consequence is fire. A pile of sun-baked tumbleweeds is essentially a mountain of perfect tinder. A single spark from a power line, a piece of machinery, or a carelessly tossed cigarette can ignite a pile, creating an instant, raging inferno that can spread to buildings and ignite wildlands with terrifying speed. During the drought-stricken years in places like eastern Washington or the plains of Colorado, communities have faced scenes that feel lifted from a bizarre post-apocalyptic film, where houses are besieged not by snow, but by endless, rolling thickets of dead vegetation. The irony is thick enough to choke on. The very solution imported to combat the hardships of drought became a symbol of its escalating chaos. A rolling, multiplying reminder that our interventions in nature often unravel in ways we never dreamed possible. We tried to anchor our livestock with a resilient plant, and instead we gave the wind a weapon and the drought a herald. The tumbleweed was a drought solution that became a rolling curse, but sometimes a dry spell can twist fate in the opposite direction, becoming a grim and unexpected savior. This paradox unfolded in the earliest days of English America, at the Jamestown settlement during the infamous starving time of 1609 to 1610. The colony was on the brink of annihilation. Food supplies had vanished, and the settlers, surrounded by the brackish waters of the James River, faced a horrific choice. They could drink from the river, but it was a known death sentence. The water downstream from their fort was a foul cocktail of human waste, arsenic from local minerals, and saltwater intrusion. Consuming it led to crippling salt poisoning, dysentery, and typhoid fever, a bacterial nightmare that brought high fever, delirium, and intestinal hemorrhage. In a normal year, they might have tried to dilute their dwindling stores of alcohol with this water. Beer and hard cider were not luxuries in the 17th century. They were staples, considered safer to drink than plain water because the brewing process often killed pathogens. But this was not a normal year. A severe, multi-year drought was gripping the region, one of the worst in centuries confirmed by tree ring data. The river ran lower and saltier than ever, concentrating its toxins to a lethal degree. To mix it with their precious beer would have been to poison their only safe hydration. So, in a brutal twist of survival logic, the drought forced their hand. They had to conserve their alcohol as pure, undiluted liquid sustenance. Each sip of beer or cider was a direct calorie and a safe drink with no risky dilution. Historians now speculate that this dreadful constraint imposed by the dry weather may have actually reduced deaths from waterborne diseases during the worst of the famine. While colonists still died in shocking numbers from outright starvation, violence, and perhaps even cannibalism, the drought might have spared them from a faster, more sweeping death by typhoid. It is a stark lesson in catastrophic trade-offs. The same environmental curse that likely ruined their attempts to farm and feed themselves also corralled them away from a different kind of poison. In their deepest desperation, the relentless dry sky, by making the river undrinkable, inadvertently guided them toward the marginally safer choice. Survival sometimes hangs not on abundance, but on being forced by circumstance to avoid the wrong well. The Jamestown settlers were cornered by a toxic river, but our modern reservoirs offer a different kind of warning, one painted in a stark, blinding white. Around the shrinking shores of Lake Powell and Lake Mead, a colossal geological tattoo has emerged, a chalky band that towers hundreds of feet above the current waterline. This is the bathtub ring, and it has become the most undeniable, humiliating symbol of the Southwest's water crisis. It is not a subtle change in statistics or a politician's warning. It is a physical scar you can see from space, a perfect record of loss. The ring itself is composed of minerals, primarily calcium carbonate and salt, that were once dissolved in the reservoir water. When the lakes were full, these minerals were invisible, suspended in the depths. But as the sun and relentless drought cause massive evaporation, the water level falls, leaving behind everything it carried. The minerals encrust the exposed sandstone cliffs in a thick, pale coating, marking the high water line like a tide line on a giant, abandoned bathtub. Each year the ring grows taller, a vertical chart of decline. For anyone boating on these lakes, the sight is dizzying and disorienting. You motor along, looking up at a sheer white wall that stretches into the sky, a brutal monument to how much water has vanished. It creates a haunting sense of smallness, as if you are navigating the bottom of a drained civilization. This visual became a staple of every news report on the Western drought, a ready-made, powerful graphic that needed no explanation. The bathtub ring did more than illustrate a shortage, it framed it as a national shame. Here was the evidence of overpromise and overuse, a glaring white error margin on the landscape itself. It sparked debates that moved far beyond water managers, reaching dinner tables and social media feeds across the country. People who had never thought about the Colorado River compact or agricultural allotments saw that ring and understood viscerally that something was deeply wrong. The symbol forced uncomfortable questions. Who gets the last drops when the ring climbs another 50 feet? Why do we have lush lawns in Phoenix when that white line in Arizona tells such a desperate story? The bathtub ring made the crisis local for everyone because it was no longer just about faraway farmers or city ordinances. It was about a glaring, physical flaw on the iconic landscape of the American West, a constant, silent rebuke to our assumptions of abundance. The bathtub ring is a silent geological rebuke, but drought can also scream in the language of fire. In the summer of 2022, Oklahoma's grasslands baked under a sun that felt like a punishment. Weeks turned into months without meaningful rain, and the earth itself seemed to exhale its last moisture in a brittle sigh. What was once a sea of waving prairie grass became something else entirely, a continent of standing tinder, crackling dry and waiting for a spark. That spark came again and again from a carelessly tossed cigarette, a dragging trailer chain, a lightning strike. The result was an apocalyptic siege the state called the Prairie Fire Drought. Wildfires, some growing to over 100,000 acres, raced across the landscape with a terrifying hunger, driven by winds that howled across the parched flatlands. Flames climbed 80 feet into the air, creating their own weather systems of swirling, superheated wind. They jumped highways as if they were mere cracks in a sidewalk, swallowing homes, barns, and centuries-old cattle ranches in minutes. The skies turned an eerie, glowing orange, and the air carried the constant, acrid scent of a world burning down. But within this catastrophe lay a cruel and bizarre irony, a closed loop of despair. The very drought that created the fuel was also crippling the response. Traditional water sources for firefighting helicopters, like farm ponds and cattle tanks, were evaporating before everyone's eyes. Pilots flying their bucket-equipped choppers would race toward a familiar blue speck on a rancher's property, only to find a shrunken, muddy puddle too shallow to dip from. This led to a scene of surreal tragedy. A helicopter would descend over the property of a rancher who was, at that very moment, watching the fire march toward his own land, his own livelihood. The chopper would then scoop the last precious gallons from the rancher's own dwindling pond, the very water he needed for his surviving cattle, and fly off to dump it on the approaching wall of flame. It was a desperate, heartbreaking calculus. The rancher was sacrificing his last hope for water to fight a fire that was coming to take everything else. The drought had created a perfect, vicious circle where the tool to fight the disaster was being stolen from the victims of the disaster itself. It was nature's brutal logic laid bare, a system collapsing in on itself, where every possible resource was being consumed by the same relentless emergency. The prairie fires in Oklahoma revealed a system consuming its own last resources, but the true heart of the West's water crisis flows through a single, overpromised artery. The Colorado River is not just a river anymore, it is a legal fiction, a bundle of water rights that add up to far more water than actually exists. This surreal predicament was born a century ago, in a moment of spectacularly bad timing. In 1922, the 7 states that rely on the river gathered to divide its bounty. The negotiators, sitting in a room far from the desert canyons, made a critical and fateful assumption. They based their calculations on river flow measurements taken during one of the wettest periods in the region's recorded history. It was like planning a family budget using your salary from the one year you won the lottery. The resulting Colorado River Compact allocated a staggering 16.5 million acre-feet of water annually to the upper and lower basin states, with another 1.5 million promised to Mexico. An acre-foot is about 326,000 gallons, enough to supply 2 average households for a year. The math was clean, decisive, and utterly divorced from reality. For decades, thanks to a series of wet years and the construction of colossal dams like Hoover and Glen Canyon, the system worked. The Southwest boomed, fueled by this legal mirage of abundance. Cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas exploded out of the desert. Vast agricultural empires in California and Arizona turned the dry soil green with crops that siphoned billions of gallons from the river. But the climate has a way of correcting accounting errors. A long-term drying trend, exacerbated by climate change, has steadily reduced the river's flow. The reservoirs built to bank the surplus are now drained to historic lows. Their bathtub rings a glaring proof of the deficit. The compact, often called the law of the river, is now a blueprint for a ghost river. The weird, almost absurd conflict lies in the unyielding nature of those century-old documents. water rights in the West are based on a principle called prior appropriation, famously summarized as first in time, first in right. The oldest claims, many held by agricultural interests, are the last to be cut, even if they are growing water-intensive crops like alfalfa in a desert. Junior rights holders, often the massive cities full of people, face the first and deepest cuts, so you have a 21st century crisis being adjudicated by a 20th century agreement based on 19th century water data. The political battles are Byzantine and fierce. States sue each other. The federal government threatens mandatory cuts if the states cannot agree on voluntary ones. Farmers talk of shutting off city taps, while urban planners whisper about buying and fallowing farmland just for its water rights, a practice known as water farming. It is a slow-motion scramble for a shrinking pie, where every drop is accounted for on paper, even as the river itself tells a different story. The compact was meant to create order and prevent conflict, but its foundational flaw has done the opposite, locking the region into a legal reality that the physical world can no longer support. The mighty Colorado is being managed by a phantom, and the drought is calling that phantom's bluff. The legal fiction of the Colorado River Compact forces a brutal arithmetic on the ground, where every drop has a price tag measured in dollars, not just survival. This calculation reaches its most stark and surreal expression in the almond and pistachio groves of California's Central Valley during the worst dry spells. Here, the drought response shifts from conservation to an act of agricultural triage, performed not with hoses but with rotor blades, when the canals run dry and the groundwater is too deep or too salty to pump. Farmers of these immensely valuable perennial trees face an impossible choice. Let centuries-old orchards die, losing a multi-million-dollar investment and years of future income, or find a way to deliver water from the sky by any means necessary. Their answer is the orchard airdrop. The scene is something from a wartime relief effort or a disaster film. Helicopters, usually the kind used for fighting fires or heavy construction, are fitted with giant, sling-loaded buckets or belly tanks that hold thousands of gallons of water. They fly low and slow over the precise, geometric rows of trees, their rotors beating a frantic, throbbing rhythm into the dry air. At the right moment, a cascade of water erupts from the aircraft, drenching a small, targeted section of the grove in a man-made downpour. The sound is a roar of engines and a crash of liquid hitting parched leaves, a bizarre symphony of desperation and technology. It is breathtakingly inefficient and staggeringly expensive, costing many times more per gallon than irrigation water ever did. But for a pistachio tree that takes over a decade to reach full production, or an almond orchard that represents a family's entire legacy, the math can still pencil out. A few strategic airdrops might deliver just enough moisture to keep the roots alive and the trees from going into fatal shock. A literal lifeline dropped from the sky to bridge the gap until the next real rain or the next water delivery. This practice lays bare the extreme economics of drought in modern America. It visualizes the point where water transitions from a shared resource to a private, liquid asset, so precious it is worth delivering by helicopter. The sight of a chopper watering a single orchard while fallow fields bake in the sun next door is a jarring portrait of value and sacrifice, asking us what we are willing to spend and what spectacle we are willing to create to keep our most lucrative roots in the ground. While helicopters wage a private war against thirst in the orchards, a far older kind of treasure hunt is being revived by the same dry conditions, one that trades water drops for gold flakes. In the Sierra Nevada foothills of California and the remote rivers of Alaska, severe droughts are performing a crude but effective form of earth-moving, draining streams and rivers to reveal bedrock and gravel bars that have not seen the sun in over a century. This sudden exposure has ignited a series of modern, drought-induced gold rushes. Recreational prospectors, armed with pans and sluice boxes instead of corporate budgets, are flocking to these newly accessible sites, driven by the same feverish dream that fueled the 49ers. The logic is simple and tantalizing. Gold is heavy. Over the decades, the steady flow of water has constantly tumbled and sorted material along riverbeds, with the densest gold flakes and nuggets sinking down, eventually settling into cracks in the bedrock or deep layers of gravel far below the active current. When a multi-year drought dramatically lowers the water level, it effectively peels back the top layer of the river. What was once a rushing channel becomes a broad expanse of damp stones and exposed bedrock shelves. These are the very spots where gold has been collecting for generations, now laid bare for the taking. In California, prospectors are revisiting the legendary veins of the Mother Lode, focusing on rivers like the American and the Yuba. The receding waters have exposed historic mining tailings, the piles of discarded rocks and sediment left by the original miners who worked with crude methods. Modern enthusiasts, with their more efficient equipment, can reprocess this old waste and often find significant flakes the old-timers missed. The scene is a peculiar blend of past and present, where someone in waterproof waders and a sun hat might be kneeling in the same gravel bed a grizzled 49er worked, both separated by time but united by the gleam in the pan. Meanwhile, in Alaska, the phenomenon is even more dramatic. Massive glacial rivers, normally icy torrents too dangerous and deep to work, have shrunk to a fraction of their width, uncovering vast gravel bars the size of football fields. These remote areas, suddenly reachable on foot, have become magnets for prospectors who fly in with small planes, setting up camps for weeks at a time. The gold found here is often coarser, sometimes even yielding small nuggets. For these modern adventurers, the drought is not a crisis but an unprecedented opportunity, a temporary window into the river's secret vault. Of course, this rush is not without its conflicts and ironies. Land management agencies grapple with a sudden influx of people in sensitive riparian zones. Environmentalists worry about the disturbance to already stressed ecosystems, and there is a palpable tension in the air, a race against the inevitable return of the rains. Every prospector knows this window is temporary. The next big storm or snowmelt will refill the channels, burying the treasure once more under tons of cold, rushing water. This creates a frantic, almost poetic urgency. The very condition that makes the gold accessible is a symptom of a larger, alarming drought. Yet for those bent over a sluice box, it feels like a personal gift from a parched landscape. It is a bizarre feedback loop where a symbol of wealth and greed becomes momentarily easier to find precisely because the thing all life needs most, water, has vanished. Gold rushes are a frantic search for what lies on top, but in California's San Joaquin Valley, the desperate hunt for water is making the very ground disappear from beneath our feet. This is the story of subsidence, a slow-motion collapse that is literally reshaping the map. During severe droughts, when surface water from rivers and reservoirs vanishes, farmers and cities turn to the only source left, the vast underground aquifers. They drill deeper and pump harder, pulling water from porous layers of sand and clay far below the surface. Think of that underground layer as a giant, waterlogged sponge supporting the weight of everything above it. When you drain the water from that sponge, it compresses, it collapses, and the land above it has no choice but to sink. This is not a minor settling of soil. We are talking about one of the most dramatic examples of human-caused subsidence on the planet. In parts of the San Joaquin Valley, the ground has dropped by over 30 feet since the 1920s. That is the height of a 3-story building vanished straight down into the earth. The visuals this creates are surreal and deeply unsettling. Canals, built to carry water across the flat valley, now buckle and warp like twisted ribbons because the ground beneath them is no longer level. Sections of concrete tilt at bizarre angles, rendering the canals useless for irrigation and creating bizarre, dry waterfalls in the middle of farmland. Bridges, once firmly anchored to riverbanks, can be left hanging over newly created gaps as the land on either side sinks away. their approaches crumbling into voids. The most haunting signs are the metal well casings that protrude high above the fields, looking like periscopes from a sunken ship. These pipes were once flush with the ground, but as the land sank around them, they were left sticking up 10, 15, even 20 feet tall, silent monuments to how much earth has been lost. On a smaller, more personal scale, the damage is just as bizarre. Homes and barns develop severe cracks in their foundations as the ground beneath them shifts unevenly. Roads develop roller coaster dips and sudden fractures. Surveyors' markers become useless, buried or raised relative to the new, lower ground level. This subsidence is permanent. The compressed aquifer layers cannot reinflate with water like a stepped-on soda can. The lost elevation is gone forever, reducing the valley's capacity to hold future groundwater and forever altering its drainage. It is a form of environmental debt with no forgiveness, a physical sinking feeling made terrifyingly real, where the solution to a temporary drought creates a permanent change in the landscape itself. The ground sinks silently in California, but in the pueblos of the Southwest, the appeal for water rises in song and movement. For centuries, tribes like the Hopi, Zuni, and Diné or Navajo have performed ceremonies deeply rooted in reciprocity with the natural world. Among the most misunderstood of these is the rain dance, a ritual of prayer and renewal meant to restore balance, not to command the clouds on demand. Yet when a severe drought tightens its grip on the region, a peculiar form of pilgrimage begins. Visitors from outside the reservations, driven by a mix of genuine curiosity and a desperate hope for relief, increasingly seek out these ceremonies, often viewing them through a lens of mystical pragmatism. The idea circulates almost like folklore that if you can just witness an authentic rain dance, you might witness a miracle, a direct intervention in the crisis. This creates a delicate and often uncomfortable tension. For the tribes, these are not public performances. They are sacred acts specific to certain times, places, and initiated members of the community. The dances are a form of communication with ancestors and spiritual forces, a serious responsibility undertaken for the benefit of all life, not a tourist attraction. The surge in outside interest during dry spells can feel invasive, reducing a profound spiritual practice to a weather service. However, some communities have navigated this complexity with careful boundaries. They might create separate cultural demonstration events that educate visitors about their traditions and worldview without exposing the most sacred rites. These events can foster understanding and provide a crucial economic lifeline, especially in remote areas hard hit by drought. They explain that the dance is part of a larger philosophy of harmony, a reminder that humans are part of the ecosystem, not its masters. The visitor who comes hoping for a quick fix for the drought might leave with a more profound lesson that the solution is not a single ritual, but a sustained relationship with the land. This intersection reveals a poignant human response to crisis. When modern solutions feel inadequate, people instinctively look to older, deeper sources of wisdom, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with a transactional hope. The rain dance in this context becomes a mirror. It reflects our own thirst back at us, asking whether we seek only water or the wisdom to deserve it. While the West grapples with its permanent water debts, the crisis has at times reached the unlikeliest of places. In the mid-1960s, a severe drought settled over the Northeast, and for the first time in living memory, the towers of Manhattan faced a terrifying prospect: the taps could actually run dry. New York City, surrounded by water but dependent on a network of upstate reservoirs, watched those lifelines sink to dangerously low levels. Panic began as a quiet murmur, then grew into a citywide scramble. The response was a campaign of public persuasion so earnest, so strangely specific, it now feels like a relic from a different world. The city printed and distributed millions of bright orange save water stickers. They were not for bumpers, but for sinks and mirrors, a constant nagging reminder in every bathroom and kitchen. Hotels, those temples of indulgence, became front-line soldiers in the conservation war. The city strong-armed them into installing timers on guest showers, devices that would automatically shut off the water after a brief, punishing interval. Imagine a business traveler expecting the full luxury of a New York stay, being unceremoniously cut off mid-shampoo by a clicking valve, all in the name of civic duty. Restaurants were instructed to serve water only upon request, a small rebellion against automatic hospitality. The campaign invaded the home, too, with newspapers and television broadcasts offering tips that bordered on the absurd, like placing a brick in the toilet tank to displace water with each flush. But as the reservoirs kept dropping, the ideas grew more desperate and far more grandiose. City planners, staring at the grim numbers, began to entertain a scheme so audacious it seemed ripped from a science fiction novel. They seriously investigated towing icebergs from Antarctica up the Atlantic coast to New York Harbor. The concept was simple in theory: find a suitable iceberg, wrap it in a gigantic plastic sheath to prevent melting, attach tugboats, and commence a months-long journey across thousands of miles of ocean. Once arrived, the ice would be chipped and melted into freshwater. It was a testament to both human ingenuity and sheer desperation. The idea that a global city could be saved by a frozen mountain from the bottom of the world. The plan, of course, never came to pass. Autumn rains eventually arrived, refilling the reservoirs and ending the immediate emergency. But the episode left a profound and unsettling mark. It proved that no city, no matter how mighty or seemingly insulated by wealth and infrastructure, is immune to the basic rules of nature. The image of New York City, a symbol of limitless human achievement, contemplating a chain of tugboats hauling a polar ice cube for survival, is a powerful corrective to our arrogance. It reminds us that the line between a bustling metropolis and a parched, desperate settlement is thinner than we dare believe, measured only in the depth of a few reservoirs and the mercy of the cloud. New York's iceberg fantasy was a fleeting crisis, but in the Sierra Nevada, the drought has written a more permanent and haunting epitaph across the mountainsides. These are the zombie forests. Walk through one, and the silence is the first thing you notice. It is not the quiet of a healthy woodland full of rustling life and bird call. It is a dead, hollow stillness. You are surrounded by a ghost army of trees, each one a gray, skeletal statue. Their needles are long gone, leaving behind bare, brittle branches that claw at the sky. The bark sloughs off in pale, papery sheets, revealing wood bleached by sun and wind. These are conifers, mostly ponderosa pines and firs, that did not simply fall over when they died. They remain upright, frozen in their final moments, creating vast, monochrome landscapes of the dead. The cause of this die-off is a 1-2 punch delivered by the drought. First, years of moisture stress severely weakened the trees. Then, armies of bark beetles, always present in the forest, found a defenseless host. A healthy tree can fight back by flooding beetle tunnels with sticky resin, but a thirsty, stressed tree cannot produce that sap. The beetles tunnel in unchecked, laying eggs beneath the bark and cutting off the tree's vascular system, its lifeline for water and nutrients. The tree is essentially strangled from within, its green needles turning a sickly rust red before falling away entirely, leaving the gray skeleton behind. The scale is what chills the soul. In some regions, entire hillsides have been transformed, turning from a vibrant green to a morbid gray in just a few seasons. But the true terror of a zombie forest is not its appearance, it is its potential. These standing dead trees are called snags, and they are the ultimate fire hazard. Dried out, resinous, and utterly devoid of moisture, they are like millions of giant matchsticks planted across the landscape. In a wildfire, they do not just burn, they explode. The heat they generate is catastrophic, creating firestorms that can launch embers miles ahead of the main blaze, spotting new fires and making containment almost impossible. They can collapse without warning, sending burning logs rolling down slopes, trapping firefighters and overrunning defenses. A zombie forest is not a relic of a past fire. It is the pre-fueled tinderbox for the next megafire, a landscape patiently waiting for a spark. Managing them is a heartbreaking and dangerous task. Forest crews must carefully fell these giants, a process called hazardous fuel reduction, knowing that any misstep could cause the brittle wood to shatter. Sometimes controlled burns are used to carefully consume the dead fuel on the forest floor, but the standing snags make even that prescribed fire perilously unpredictable. The zombie forests stand as a stark monument to a climate shift that has already happened, a line crossed. They are the ghosts of a cooler, wetter past and the kindling for a hotter, more volatile future, forcing us to walk through a graveyard of our own making. The zombie forests stand as monuments to unintended consequences, but sometimes a drought's legacy is not a graveyard but a playground. Southern California is home to one of the world's most famous body surfing spots, a place called the Wedge in Newport Beach. Its existence and its famously dangerous heaving waves is a direct and quirky result of the dry desperation of the 1930s. During that era's severe drought, the Newport harbor began to suffer from a different but related problem, siltation. With less freshwater flowing out from the inland watersheds to flush the harbor entrance, sand and sediment began to clog the channel, threatening the viability of the port. The solution was straightforward engineering: build a rock jetty. This long, angled wall of boulders, completed in 1936, was designed to block the natural longshore drift of sand, keeping the harbor mouth clear for boats. It worked perfectly for navigation, but the ocean had other plans. The new jetty acted as a sudden, hard boundary in the sea. When a south swell rolls in, the waves hit this immovable rock wall at a sharp angle. Instead of washing past, the energy of the wave gets reflected back out to sea. This reflected wave then collides head-on with the next incoming swell. The result is a spectacular and terrifying merger. Two walls of water slam together, combining their force to create a single, explosive peak that can jack up to over 20 feet tall before throwing itself forward in a vicious, grinding curl into shallow water. This is not a normal surfing wave, it is a hydraulic monster. Locals quickly discovered that this accidental feature was perfect for body surfing and later skimboarding. Riding the Wedge requires no board at all, just pure nerve and timing. Runners sprint into the shallows as the reflected and incoming waves meet, leaping into the churning vortex to get launched down the line in a barrel of pure white water. It is an adrenaline ritual with its own unique culture and legends, a place where daredevils are made and bones are broken. The irony is delicious. A structure built to solve a crisis caused by a lack of freshwater inadvertently created a legendary saltwater phenomenon. The very effort to manage a drought side effect gifted the world a unique and brutal wave, a permanent reminder that when we try to control nature's shortages, we might accidentally manufacture a new kind of abundance, one that demands a very different kind of respect. Florida's Everglades are a river of grass, a slow, shallow sheet of water that defines an entire ecosystem. But when drought grips the region, that sheet tears apart. The water retreats into isolated, shrinking pools, and life is forced to congregate in a desperate, crowded truce. This concentration effect has created an unexpected and bizarre front line in Florida's war against one of its most destructive invaders, the Burmese python. These massive constrictors, released or escaped from the pet trade, have exploded in population, decimating native mammals and birds. They are incredibly difficult to find in the vast flooded marshes. A drought, however, changes the rules of the hunt. As the wetlands dry, both predator and prey are funneled toward the same dwindling water sources. Rabbits, raccoons, wading birds, and deer all crowd the muddy edges of the last remaining sloughs. And where the prey goes, the pythons follow. The dry spell effectively corrals the elusive snakes, making them far more likely to be in predictable places. This environmental squeeze has been harnessed by the state in a uniquely Floridian form of crisis management, the sanctioned python hunting competition. The most famous is the annual Python Challenge, a 10-day event where hundreds of participants, from professional trappers to adventurous amateurs, fan out across the Everglades. Their tools are airboats, those iconic flat-bottomed vessels with giant airplane propellers on the back, designed to skim over inches of water and now over cracked mud and sawgrass. The sound of their engines becomes a constant, buzzing chorus across the shrunken landscape. Hunters cruise the desiccated canals and marsh edges, their eyes scanning for the distinctive diamond-patterned skin of a python basking on a dry levee or coiled at the water's edge. The scene is surreal, a blend of high-tech gadgetry and primal pursuit. Teams use thermal imaging scopes at night to spot the heat signatures of the cold-blooded snakes against the cooler ground. They wade through muck armed with special hooks and bags, knowing they are tackling a creature that can grow over 18 feet long and possess immense crushing strength. The competition offers cash prizes for the most pythons removed and for the longest one captured, turning an ecological disaster into a grimly incentivized sport. For the hunters, it is a strange mix of adrenaline and civic duty. They speak of the thrill of the stalk, the tension of the capture, and the sobering reality of holding an animal that has no natural place in this delicate ecosystem. Each removed python represents dozens, perhaps hundreds, of native animals saved. The drought, in this context, becomes a perverse ally. It creates a moment of vulnerability for an otherwise unstoppable invader, a temporary window where human effort can make a tangible dent. It is a stark lesson in unintended strategy, where one environmental crisis is briefly leveraged to combat another, all played out in the shrinking, muddy pools of a paradise under siege. The python hunts in Florida reveal a crisis corralled by drought, but a far deadlier form of capture occurred in the lungs of a generation. During the Dust Bowl, the very air became a weapon. This was the era of dust pneumonia, a medical horror born not from germs, but from the earth itself turned against its people. As the winds scoured the bare fields of Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas, they lifted not just topsoil, but a fine, abrasive powder finer than flour. This was silt, a particulate so small it could slip past the body's natural defenses. People breathed it in all day, every day. It coated food, lined the inside of cups, and sifted through the cracks of even the most tightly sealed homes. At night, families would sometimes wake choking, their mouths gritty, a brown film on their lips. The constant inhalation had a brutal physical effect. The fine dust particles infiltrated the deepest sacs of the lungs, the alveoli, where oxygen exchange happens. The body, recognizing an invader, would flood the area with immune cells and fluid trying to wash the dirt away. But this created a terrible paradox. The lungs, meant to be filled with air, became clogged with a thick, muddy slurry. Victims, often strong farmers and their children, would be seized by racking, painful coughs that brought up phlegm dark with soil. Their chests would rattle with a sound one doctor described as the crinkling of cellophane. They struggled for every breath, their skin turning a dusky blue from lack of oxygen, a condition called cyanosis. Doctors were baffled. This was not bacterial pneumonia, and it did not respond to the medicines of the time. They were essentially watching people slowly suffocate on the land they had tried to farm. Autopsies revealed lungs that were shockingly heavy, their healthy pink tissue marbled with gritty black streaks. The literal earth of the Great Plains solidified inside the human body. In a desperate attempt at survival, families resorted to a haunting form of homemade filtration. They would soak bed sheets and towels in water and hang them over every window and door frame, hoping the damp fabric would trap the dust before it entered the home. At night, they might even drape wet cloths over the faces of their sleeping children, a macabre bedtime ritual in a world where the air was no longer safe to breathe. The wet sheets became a symbol of the era's helpless ingenuity, a fragile barrier against an enemy that was everywhere and in everything. Dust pneumonia did not just kill, it created a pervasive, low-grade terror, the understanding that with every involuntary breath you were burying yourself from the inside out. A vibrant green lawn in the heart of a California drought was a confession waiting to happen. But in 2014, as the state baked under one of its worst dry spells on record, a new kind of alibi took root, one sold by the gallon. An entire industry sprang up to offer homeowners and businesses a startling alternative to ripping out their thirsty turf or facing the shame of a brown yard. They could simply paint it, lawn dyes long used on golf courses and sports fields to maintain a perfect aesthetic during dormancy, found a massive new market in suburban driveways. The process was straightforward. You would mow your dead, brittle grass as short as possible, then spray it with a non-toxic, water-based pigment, often in a choice of shades from emerald to olive. Within hours, the transformation was complete. A scorched, yellowed plot that screamed of water restriction violation was now a lush, impossibly perfect green carpet. From the street, it looked like the homeowner was defying the drought, flaunting their privilege. Up close, the illusion shattered. The grass crunched underfoot like straw. It felt like walking on a brittle, painted rug. The color was sometimes too uniform, a flat, cartoonish green that nature never produces. If you knelt down, you could see the pigment coating each individual blade, a thin veneer of vitality over death. This practice ignited a fierce debate. Proponents, including the dye manufacturers, argued it was a harmless, temporary solution. It maintained curb appeal and property values without using a single drop of water. It kept homeowners associations at bay and satisfied municipal codes that penalized unsightly, unwatered lawns. For some, it was a psychological salve, a way to look out the window and see normalcy instead of a constant reminder of crisis. They called it a pragmatic compromise. Critics, however, saw it as the ultimate act of greenwashing in the most literal sense. They argued it was a superficial, almost farcical response to a profound environmental emergency. Instead of adapting to the reality of a desert climate by embracing native, drought-tolerant landscaping, people were spending money and effort to fake an unsustainable ideal. It prioritized image over substance, creating a collective illusion that everything was fine. The surreal sight of a neighborhood filled with vibrantly green, yet utterly silent and dead lawns felt like a scene from a dystopian satire. It was a perfect symbol of a culture trying to have it both ways, to perform ecological responsibility while clinging to a symbol of consumption that the land could no longer support. The painted lawns asked an uncomfortable question about our relationship with nature. Are we trying to live within it, or are we merely interested in creating a convincing backdrop for our lives, even if that backdrop is just paint on dead grass? The painted lawns of California were a facade of normalcy, but a century and a half earlier, a drought in the remote Montana territory was so severe it did not just change the color of the grass, it moved the seat of government itself. The years 1863 and 64 were part of a punishing dry cycle across the American West. In what would become Montana, the consequences were not measured in dead lawns but in vanished trails and empty creeks. This was a landscape defined by gold rush boomtowns, connected by treacherous mountain passes and dependent on reliable water sources for travel. The territorial capital at the time was Bannack, a rough and tumble mining camp that had struck it rich. But as the drought tightened its grip, the very routes that made Bannack accessible began to disintegrate. The streams that teams of oxen and horses relied upon for drinking water dried up to cracked mud. The sparse grasslands that fed the pack animals withered to dust. making the journey to Bannack for the legislative session became not just difficult, but a potentially deadly expedition through a parched and perilous void. The lawmakers, many of whom were miners and businessmen from the rival boomtown of Virginia City, faced a logistical nightmare. They could not govern if they could not safely reach the capital. The solution they devised was as pragmatic as it was unprecedented. They decided to bring the capital to them. In an act of raw frontier practicality, the legislators simply packed up the entire territorial government. This meant gathering every official document, every land record, every piece of legislation, the fragile paper archives of a fledgling territory, and loading them onto wagons. Imagine the scene: dusty legislators and clerks carefully boxing ledgers and maps, not to protect them from flood, but to transport them across a desert they themselves had created through a lack of rain. The wagon train then set out from Bannack, not with settlers seeking a new life, but with the entire apparatus of law and order, rolling eastward toward the newer, more prosperous strikes in Virginia City. The move was not officially sanctioned by the federal government in Washington, D.C. for some time. It was, in essence, a drought-induced coup, a change of address forced by hydrology. Virginia City, with its more reliable local water sources and its booming population, simply absorbed the functions of government. For years, it operated as the de facto capital because the legal capital had become a logistical island stranded by dry creek beds. This created a bizarre and uniquely Western constitutional crisis. Where exactly was the government? It was wherever the papers were, and the papers were where the water was. The drought had, in a very real sense, rewritten the map of power. It was not an army or a vote that relocated Montana's center of gravity, but the simple, relentless absence of a resource so basic that its lack could void the authority of a place. The capital eventually moved again to Helena, but the episode stands as a stark testament to the absolute primacy of water in the building of America. When the trails turned to dust, even the law had no choice but to follow the last remaining drops. The painted lawns and wandering capitals are echoes of recent crises, but to understand the true scale of what we face, we must learn to read the autobiography of a tree. Deep in the White Mountains of California, gnarled and twisted sentinels stand silent against the sky. These are the bristlecone pines, the oldest living non-clonal organisms on Earth. Some of these trees were already ancient saplings when the pyramids of Egypt were being planned. Their secret is not just longevity, but memory, etched in concentric circles within their trunks. This science is called dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, and it has rewritten our understanding of drought in America. Each year, a tree adds a new layer of growth, a ring. In a good year, with ample rain and mild temperatures, that ring is wide and robust. In a bad year, a year of thirst and stress, the ring is narrow, a tight, desperate line. By carefully extracting a core sample, scientists can read this history like a barcode of climate. They can match the pattern of wide and narrow rings across living trees, then overlap those patterns with the rings of dead wood preserved in ancient logs, building a timeline that stretches back thousands of years. What this library of wood has revealed is both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Our modern droughts, the ones that empty reservoirs and spark water wars, are not exceptional. They are, in the grand sweep of time, relatively mild. The tree rings tell of past events that dwarf our current crises, periods scientists call megadroughts. These were not dry spells that lasted a few years. They were climatic regimes that gripped the continent for decades, sometimes for entire generations. The rings from the 12th and 13th centuries, for instance, show a suffocating squeeze that lasted for nearly 40 years in the southwest, a drought that likely pushed the ancestral pueblones from their cliffside cities. Another, in the 16th century, appears to have lasted for almost 80 years. Imagine a lifetime where the sky simply withheld its bounty, a childhood, adulthood, and old age defined by dust and scarcity. This is the context the bristlecone pines provide, Our current water shortages are not a temporary deviation from a stable norm. They are a return to a deeper, more volatile rhythm of the continent, now amplified by a warming climate. The tree rings offer no prediction, but they deliver a profound warning. They show that the atmosphere is capable of shifts far more severe and sustained than anything our modern civilization has ever witnessed. The parched lakebeds and zombie forests of today are not the end of the story. They might just be the opening chapters of a much longer, drier tale written in the silent, stubborn wood of the oldest living things among us. From ancient child's footprints to mobsters' barrels, from phantom towns to painted grass, these 33 stories are more than a collection of oddities. They are a testament to a single, powerful truth. Drought is not merely an absence, it is an agent of revelation. It peels back the watery veil of the present, exposing the bones of the past, the tensions of the present, and the stark choices of the future. We have seen it act as an archaeologist, uncovering lost cities and ice age graveyards. We have watched it become a detective, solving cold cases the river meant to hide forever. It has been a cruel taskmaster, driving communities to prayer, to dynamite, and to the surreal economics of helicopter airdrops. And it has been a silent artist, reshaping landscapes with bathtub rings and zombie forests. Each story, in its own bizarre way, is about adaptation. It is about the human spirit contorting itself, sometimes with ingenuity, sometimes with desperation, to meet the challenge of a thirsting world. They show us that our relationship with water is the most fundamental story America tells about itself, a narrative of abundance, of risk, of engineering triumph, and of ecological debt. These tales are not confined to history books or distant deserts. They are written in the cracking soil of your own state, in the level of your local reservoir, in the strange choices your city makes when the rains delay. So the next time you hear a drought warning, look beyond the statistics, look for the story it is beginning to tell. What hidden history might be waiting in the mud of a receding lake near you? What future adaptation is being born in the dry heat? We would love to hear it. Share your own local drought story in the comments below, the weird, the worrying, the ingenious. And if you want to keep exploring the hidden layers of this country, from its bizarre history to its forgotten corners, make sure to subscribe. The next revelation is always just a dry spell away.